My name is Kathy Hoshar. I'm the current ACSA president and a faculty member at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. Maybe we'll spend 10 more seconds to let everybody log on and then we'll get started. Danielle, does that look like everybody's in?
Yes.
Okay, all right. Well, welcome to this session. Before we begin, we do want to acknowledge a sobering and troubling start to 2025. We know that we have member schools impacted by the fires in Los Angeles, and we want to share our thoughts and our sympathies to them, anyone who's here in this meeting, to your families and communities. We understand that we're convening during a time of significant loss and hardship, and we want to recognize this and the difficult work to recover, rebuild, and to educate all of our students to work effectively in these contexts. We also know that many of you are freezing cold, so sending warm wishes from Hawaii. As far as our session, we want to welcome our guests from NCARB. So in November of last year, we had the NCARB President Ken Van Tyne, the NCARB Competency Task Force Chair Sean Roberts, and the now newly retired Harry Falconer present the competency framework at the Administrators Conference in Denver, which generated some serious discussions with that group. So we invited NCARB back today to open up this conversation to more of our members. So thank you. The competency framework that they're presenting marks a major shift for architectural licensure with potential significant impacts for education. We look forward to constructive conversations with NCARB that examine the role and value of education within this new framework. So today we have Jared Zern, NCARB Senior Vice President of Programs, who oversees the evolution of licensure processes and programs supporting licensure. Previously, he operated as a sole proprietorship and served as a faculty and division chair at Minnesota State Community and Technical College. We are also joined by Jeremy Fretz, NCARB's Assistant Vice President of Policy and International Relations, who leads education and continuing education efforts, exploring ways to integrate education into the licensing process. Yes. I think that was just an interjection there. He's a registered architect in Virginia and Indiana, and he previously worked as a designer and project architect in the Midwest and Mid-Atlantic regions. So with that, Jared and Jeremy, thanks so much for joining us.
Great. Well, thank you, Kathy, and thank you all for joining. I think we're up to 75 people now, it says on the list. So we were hoping to have like a lot of discussion, which I think is going to be a challenge, Jeremy, with 75 people on a Zoom meeting. Well, we'll give it our best shot. So on that, I'm going to go ahead and start sharing. We did put together a presentation, but we also do really want this to be a conversation as much as possible. So you can put comments in the chat. Jeremy's going to sort of pay attention to that, moderate, interject. We also have some built-in breaks to stop and talk specifically and actually discuss, because we do want to run through basically the competency framework a little bit, and then also deal with sort of our conversations around the evolution of the licensure process. So that's kind of the high level. Jeremy, any other words of wisdom before I go ahead and share?
Good start.
Let's go. Okay. Give it a second to launch. Here we go. So I guess Kathy gave me the quick introduction. I will just add to it. I actually, surprisingly, Jeremy and I were joking around before this session that like most of you won't even know me, right? You all know Harry. Harry's retired. I'm some stranger now showing up, but I actually am looking at the names going, hey, I know a lot of you. This is great. So really, we're here to talk to you about the work that's been underway for the last couple of years. As Kathy had said, yes, I have a background teaching 9 years at a community college before I joined NCARB. I've been with NCARB now over 16 years. Primarily focused on the exam for the majority of those 16 years, but really branching out into the other areas of the programs that are underway. So we can talk to you a little bit about the past if you want, the now, the very right now, the very near term. We're going to tell you about some of the stuff that's coming up in the short term changes, and then sort of the long-term evolutions that we think might happen. But as we all know, long-term evolutions are nothing better than a guess anyway. So on that, Jeremy, anything else to introduce yourself?
Just glad again to see so many names in here that I recognize, and hopefully we'll see some of you in person in March at the ACSA conference. And again, I work with our education committee. They will be meeting this weekend, in fact. So I will see some of you even there. But happy to be here and have this opportunity to try and maybe demystify, explain, maybe even enthuse and excite you a little bit about this work that we've been doing. So Jared, you want to get us to our next slide? So again, today, as Jared alluded to, we're going to have a few polls to help us better understand you all and make sure we have a good sense of who's here in the room. I know we have people already. I see names from both community colleges, accredited programs, folks just down the street from me and far afield. So we'll learn a little bit more about who's here. We're going to go through the NCARB Competency Standard that was published in the fall. And again, if you have questions about the competency standard, you can pop those in the chat and we'll come back to them, or I will try and answer as we get it as possible. And then we're also going to open it up a couple of times for live questions and discussion. So then we'll move to updates on the current effort that has begun to envision our future licensure programs, and that is in progress and developing. And then we'll close with some more discussion. And really, again, we want to talk about what the possibilities are. We think that there are some exciting possibilities for education as a result of this. So hopefully we can end with some feedback from you all and some creative possibilities. So as I mentioned, we want to see who's here and a little bit about how much you know already or not about this. So if you would go to menti.com, you can also use the QR code if you want to do it on your phone, your smartphone, but if you're on the website, menti.com, and the code is 13742472. Folks get logged in there. This is not, Jared has not run this through the exam committee or the psychometricians.
Nope.
This is just a real simple poll.
So we're not claiming any validity or reliability in the results, but we do want to get a sense of what's going on. All right, I think we got a lot of thumbs up. People are ready. Let's go ahead. And again, the login information is going to be on the other slides as we move forward. So.
Jared, we lost it there.
Oh, we lost. Start again. There we go.
So the first question, have you participated in, listened to any other NCARB webinars about the competency standard or our future licensure processes? So we did present at the administrators conference. We've also presented at Region 4, NCARB's Region 4, had a good many educators there, as well as on the AIA as a webinar, and then Jared, of course, did one on YouTube for our NCARB Live. So.
Like we got a pretty good mix. That's good, but leaning a little more into like, hey,
regular. Thanks. Welcome back, regulars.
Yeah, we got a few regulars. All right, let's keep going.
And our next question, how familiar are you with the competent? Oops, there it went again.
It wants to restart every time tonight.
How familiar are you with the competency standard and the 16 competencies? In other words, have you read it?
Or people are just voting for the cute dog because they can. That's the deal.
All right. Love seeing a fair amount of familiarity. And for those of you that are looking at the cute dog, we will make sure that you know something by the end of today.
All right. Okay. So we have some familiarity. That's a good thing. I think we got one more poll question. Let's see if Menti's going to make me launch it twice. Pretty good chance.
All right. And how are you feeling about the competency standard? Oh, that's excited, not exited.
Oh, that's true. It should be excited.
Karen wouldn't say she couldn't put it down.
Not that exciting.
The good news is it's not very long. So
okay, so it looks like we've got some people who are somewhat familiar, Jeremy. They've got, but there's some concern here though. If we tie that with some of the unknowns, so we're gonna have to kind of unravel, like you said, some of the mysteries around this, hopefully over the next hour. So, all right, well, let's jump in.
Jared, tell us about the competency standard.
All right. So as Jeremy, he alluded to this earlier, this actually was adopted by the NCARB Board of Directors in the fall of 2024. So it was back in the September timeframe. The Board of Directors adopted it. We're going to talk to you more about the process. Trust me, it just didn't come to life in October of 2024 is when we actually released it. It was a multi-year effort. But of course, we want to explain, first of all, just what it is, right? So here's the goal of why NCARB put this together was when we looked at our current world in NCARB, where we're trying to wrap our heads around what are the things that matter for architectural licensure, today we actually refer people to, well, go read the AXP guidelines and then, check out the 96 tasks, and that's spread across about a dozen pages, and, consume all of that information. Oh, and then by the way, then what we need you to do is, go check out those NAB standards, because you got to understand like education's requirement in a lot of our jurisdictions. So go check out that document, and we send them a link to that. Oh yeah, and then while you're at it, there's just one more thing. Head over to the ARE guidelines. It's only 135 pages long, but only about 17 of them really relate to the exam objectives. So go check those out. And if you look at the AXP guidelines, and you look at the ARE guidelines, and you look at the NAB standards, hey, that's everything we think it really matters to become a licensed architect. You probably were following me and went, that seems crazy, Jared. Why would you do that to somebody? And that's exactly the question we asked ourselves at NCARB. Is like, there's got to be a better way to consolidate this and make it more concise about what do we really care about when it comes to giving somebody a license to practice architecture as a state regulatory board. And that's what took us down this path to developing the competency standard. So what we want is we want a structure, right? That, as it says in the thing, we want a structure, but it's got to represent that integrated, right, world that we all live in. We're all interrelated. It's what we're doing. So we have narrowed this thing down to 8 pages. So we can point somebody now to an 8-page document and say, hey, these are the 16 key things that really matter if you want to get a license to practice architecture. The big goal of this is in the second part there, which is we want focused and aligned programs. The other thing you probably realize is that the AXP and the ARE haven't always been great at aligning. Again, Jeremy and I will admit this, we work at NCARB, right? So over the last several years, we've tried to make them more aligned, and I think we did with AXP and ARE 5.0, but we really, even at that point, they were developed like this. They weren't developed like this. And so as we move forward, we want to have one guiding document. That's the competency standard for us that we can refer to regardless of whether you're saying, is somebody competent based on their education? Is somebody competent based on their experience? Or is somebody competent based on taking an assessment, right? Like whatever the proof is, it all needs to point back to the same competency standard. That's the goal of why we did this.
So what is a competency?
What is a competency? And so here's a key thing, and this is what we really focused on during the development of the competency standard. It's not just knowledge, skill, and ability. And if you've been around NCARB for a while, we throw those terms around a lot, right? Oh, it's the KSAs. We don't even say what they are anymore. We just call them KSAs. But really what we wanted to focus on is the ability to perform a particular job function. So it's doing the thing that matters. It's not the simple little task that adds up to it. It's all of the parts. It is an observable ability is what we're going to be trying to measure. And it does relate to knowledge, skill, and ability, but it also relates to attitudes and it relates to behaviors. And this is a switch for us at NCARB because we usually haven't ever talked about that. We've only talked about what do you need to know, what can you do, and that's what we cared about in licensure. And now what we're saying is, wait, actually your attitudes matter, and so do your behaviors in a different way. And so the competency is a little broader in what it's trying to address, while at the same time trying to focus in on what are the key things that really matter for licensure.
I think a piece of that is context as well. It's how do you observing that ability, that skill in context of, the context of being a professional and the context of a variety of situations you might find yourself in as a practitioner. So competency to practice at licensure is the focus. And this is, again, a bit of a change, right? There's a focus on, what a narrowing in of focus on what is necessary to protect the public health, safety, and welfare. And we'll talk later in more depth about the idea that there's everything an architect could do, right? There's so much in our profession, so much to be learned, so much that can be learned in history and theory and technology. It's an enormous corpus of information. So there's everything an architect could do. And then there's everything that matters for licensure, everything an architect must be able to do to protect the public health, safety, and welfare. And that's a subset, certainly, of everything that we all, want to know and might be interested in and could do. But there's a subset of what we must be able to do to get a license. And so the competency standard really tries to narrow that in, not, what is architecture capital A at its greatest and broadest, but what is necessary to protect the public and grant a state license. And so we found a lot of folks really resonate with the graphic on the right, the necessary level of ability. And if you think of it as someone goes from a novice to an advanced beginner to competent, that's where we need you to be to get a license. And then you can continue to proficient, expertise, being a specialist even. But we need that baseline of competent at initial licensure.
So I mentioned earlier that the development of the competency standard actually was a multi-year effort. It took over 2 years. We actually started down this path in 2021. I mean, that's now we're talking like 4 years ago. And we started with something called the analysis of practice. And I am sure some of you on this call participated in the analysis of practice because we had over 19,000 people all across the United States, right? Most of them licensed, but not all licensed, but people in the built environment engage in this big study that we did. And so from 2021 to 2022, that's when NCARB was really pursuing. We studied 10 different domains across the profession because we didn't want to just understand like what do you need to know right when you get your license, but we really wanted to understand architecture, that capital A architecture that Jeremy mentioned. And we even did a little bit of forecasting, like, but how do we think the profession is going to change in the next 5 to 7 years? So it all started back in 2021. And from that research, the data that came out of those 19,000 survey respondents, then we got into this big discussion about what does it mean to be qualified. Jeremy's mentioned it. You're going to hear us say probably a lot of different things. Some people say like minimally competent. Some people will say just qualified. Some might say entry level. But really what we're trying to get at it is what's that threshold at which point a state licensing board is going to be comfortable enough to hand somebody a license to practice architecture independently. And we still are talking about independent practice. You're going to see things about collaboration and coordination and all of those things in the competency standard. But in the end, a license is still held by an individual, and one individual, as maybe unrealistic as it seems, takes responsibility for all of that work. So we put together a task force and we basically hammered for about a year from 2022 into 2023 on what does it mean to be qualified, right? To just kind of pare it down. And they did the best they could, the task force. And in 2022 and into 2023, then we released additional surveys because we're like, great, we have this task force, but now we got to really check their work. So we received responses from nearly another 5,000 people over that time during different focus groups and surveys as we sort of said, hey, here's what we think the competencies to architecture should be. Do you agree? What did we miss? What did we overpromise, right? That really people shouldn't need to know how to do. And from that was the validation survey, some of the screenshots there from the final proposal that came out, the final study. And it landed in fall of 2023. And from that time, then NCARB took the work back to a variety of committees. So it wasn't just a single task force anymore. Now it was multiple committees, different stakeholder groups. Jeremy mentioned he works with the education committee here at NCARB. If you had participated on that during this time frame, I'm sure you heard us talk about this. We got feedback from all kinds of different groups about, again, what do we like? What don't we like? Where did we miss? How does this glue together? How does it not? And then over the course of 2023 into 2024 was more refinement. we just kept kind of hammering away at this, right? Like, what do we absolutely need to require for somebody to get a license? And by that time, we got into the fall of 2024, and the board of directors was confident in adopting the standard that is now published on our website. So again, multi-year, started in 2021 with initial data findings all the way through 2024. You can never say NCARB moves too quickly, because we typically don't, right? That's the reality, right, Jeremy? And so here we are. It's the competencies. This is done, right? It was done. It has been adopted. And what you're seeing at a very high level, because the document is 8 pages long, this is one slide. What you're seeing here is the overview of the 16 competencies that have been defined. We are organizing them into 3 domains. That does not mean there's going to be 3 ARE tests in the future. It does not, it doesn't mean that we're going to break AXP down into 3 areas in the future. We simply wanted to organize it in some way. Don't get hung up on the domains, right? Just helped us frame it a little bit. So the first 8 competencies that you see really all do fall under design and documentation, right? We all know big part of architecture is designing stuff, obviously, and then documenting that design concept so that somebody can build it. I will highlight a couple of these competencies. I'm sure if you read through the list, you're like, makes sense, that makes sense. The one that got a lot of debate, honestly, inside of the task force and with feedback groups was competency number 5, which is integrate socio-demographic considerations and universal design principles. First of all, people wanted to debate what we meant by universal design principles. Admittedly, lots of time spent on that one. But we also got into like this whole big discussion about should a just qualified architect be able to integrate demographic considerations, right, across society? Is that really an expectation? Is that what we're saying? And the answer is yes. But what I'm going to point out is that the task force very intentionally said integrate. They didn't say go out, solve all the world's problems, and come back and refine a solution that's going to solve all those world's problems. What they said was, you're going to have to understand what socio-demographic considerations are out there on a project, and you're going to have to integrate the information that is like available to you, right? So we basically clearly lowered the bar on this one and said, yes, if I tell you this is what's going on in your neighborhood, if this is what it says, in different policies and different community groups, then react to that appropriately. Notice the difference with competency 4, which is create, right? So 4, 6, 7, those are the big ones. They're the create competencies. So number 4, create design solutions that support public and environmental well-being, right? It doesn't get any simpler than that when it comes to NCARB talking about design. When you're designing a project, your job is to support the public and environmental well-being. That's what we're founded on, is public protection. That's why architecture is a regulated profession. Jeremy, some of your thoughts on the design and documentation domain.
Oh yeah, you stole my thunder on 6 and 7.
Sorry,
Because as I've socialized this and talked to people, that's usually what's quickly overlooked is like, well, where's design? And it's really in there in 6 and 7 as you're not just, you are, from the state licensure standpoint, you are addressing the public requirements, but you're also addressing your client's requirements, the project requirements. And so that's right there in competency 6. And then, the deliverables, competency 7 is sort of interesting because that's create deliverables that convey a design solution. That's something we assume, but it sometimes gets left out. We've discovered last year that it's not even actually in the NAB conditions. So it's sort of funny. So we've got that in there, creating the deliverables. That's both your schematic presentation and your construction document deliverables bundled into that one. And then you get more construction documentation in 9, prepare and administer documentation in the construction phase.
So when we jump into the second domain, that construction administration domain, again, lots of conversation around this one. Actually, some of the very early feedback that we got from a lot of practitioners was, that's not big enough. You need to beef up construction administration. I spend so much of my time on this, right? Like this, like you got it. Like, and I'm not kidding, at one time, there were like 6 things in there. Like they wanted everything listed that an architect could do during the construction phase. But as the task force really talked about it and said, no, think about competency. Like, what are those observable things that somebody can do? It's not a list of tasks. It's not, oh, got to do pay requests. Oh, got to do punch list. Oh, got to, no, that's not what we wanted to do. What they really came down to was they said, there's really two things you do in the construction phase. One, you prepare and administer documentation. Like, and we do that, right? We know that's what architects do. When the project goes out for construction, guess what? I'm in paperwork mode. That's what I used to do, right? So there's all of this required documentation around it, and that's a huge competency, but that's what they wanted to focus on. And then the next one, of course, what's the other key thing you do as an architect during construction is you make sure that the contractor is, or contractors nowadays, are actually delivering on what they're supposed to. So that's the evaluate the progress of construction for conformance with the contract documents. If you break it down to those two basic things, yeah, that's architecture in the construction phase. So are there a lot of tasks? Absolutely. Are each of those tasks really an independent competency? No, they're not, because that's just a single job task. The bigger competency is know how to do the documentation and know how to evaluate progress. And then our third domain is
Yeah.
practice and project management. Oh, do you have something to say on
I
construction?
was just going to say this. I was going to ask. This one had a lot of discussion, right, about how much business skill and project management, practice management skill. There's kind of a lot right now in AXP. So how did this shake out?
Yeah, well, so here's what I tell you. First of all, the competencies that you see in front of you are not the same size, right? And I think that's also part of the challenge NCARB is overcoming right now as this document has been released. Our people look at this and they're like, my gosh, they have what, 6 competencies related to just running a project and running a practice, but they only have 8 competencies related to design and documentation. Well, the reality is what we know are those first 8 are a heck of a lot bigger than these last 6. But we also really debated, do you need to know the stuff, right, to get a license that's outlined in those 6 things at the end? And again, the committee and the task force and all the feedback eventually came back with the answer of yes. Yes, you do. Architects that hold a license to practice should be expected to be competent at executing contracts, managing work plans, schedule and budget, right? Doing some organization and coordination, right? Because if they can't, it can harm the client, right? And if it harms the client, it can harm the public. And that's what we care about from a regulatory perspective. So I will point out, I think there's been some good level setting that has occurred with the new competency standard compared to the current ARE and the current AXP. If you notice, competency 16 uses that lovely word foundational, right? And it just says understand. And those of you that are educators, and you all are, you know what that means. We're not looking for geniuses here. We just need you to understand the basics of running a business so that you don't go out of business to the point where you harm the client. After that, NCARB doesn't care. And I'm going to say that again. NCARB does not care that Jeremy Fretz, licensed architect, is going to become rich and famous. Doesn't matter to me, Jeremy. Sorry to hurt your feelings. What NCARB cares about is that Jeremy Fretz, licensed architect, if he takes on a client and promises to deliver a project, he does not harm that client. He does not harm the public that is going to engage in that project. So that's some harsh language coming from NCARB, but we got to be honest about what our role is in the grand scheme of architecture. So Jeremy, other thoughts on this lovely world of practice and project management that we do spend a lot of time talking about, even though it's much smaller in the grand scheme of things?
Yeah, I will say, it's you're right. Some of these competencies you could achieve in maybe one class session, right? As long as the student is listening. Maybe understanding ethical and professional standards. We can do that in a couple, pretty quickly, I think, and have that level of understanding. I will say that many folks that I talk to really talk about, and you all probably experience this too, how much a part of their work life is focused on managing the projects and managing all the balls that are in the air. So that's really has become a bigger part of our profession in these days.
All right, so here we go. We got a competency standard. There's 16 things out there. Now the big question, of course, is like, what's NCARB going to do with this thing? Maybe that's what some of those nervous people were about, Jeremy, early on.
And
So here's
right after this, you get to ask questions. So.
Exactly. We're coming right up on our question time. So first thing, here's what NCARB is going to do. We're going to make updates to the current AXP and the current ARE based on this competency standard. And when is that going to happen? That is going to happen, I will tell you, in I'm thinking mentally in early 2026. I got to think my calendar year. So think late December or very early January. We are planning on rolling out updates to the architectural experience program. The board of directors at NCARB is actually talking about potential updates coming up here this week. We have a board meeting coming up this week. And then those will be released out for member comment. Hopefully, if the board likes the ideas, that'll happen over the course of the next several months. The ARE is going through the same process, right? The architect registration exam. We're basically going back through comparing our current exam objectives to the new competency standard and course correcting some of our test objectives. Like I mentioned, foundational business principles are what we should care about at NCARB, not running advanced architectural practice. So we're going to be going through and adjusting our exam to pull out the stuff that's no longer relevant. Right now, we've identified about 50, I would say 15 to 20%, nothing's finalized, about 15 to 20% of the exam content across the 6 divisions will likely get updated to some degree. The exam takes a little bit longer to update. So again, we're thinking AXP updates early, like late 2025, early 2026. Exam probably to follow 3 to 6 months later because it just takes us a little bit longer. So that's the first thing we're going to do. Already in the works. Second thing we're going to do, we're using the competency standard to help guide selection of future assessment tools and processes. Jeremy and I are going to talk more about that here after the discussion. We're going to get into that envisioning the future licensure process. That's what this second bullet's all about. We'll spend way more time on that here in a bit. Third thing we're going to do, we do want to inform conversations related to education and the accreditation standards. We'll admit it. We want to inform the conversations. We're not going to control them. We know that. But we're thinking, hey, this is the stuff that matters for licensure. You guys know about, right? You can do with it what you want, but we'll keep talking to you. That's our plan. And then the third, and I guess final bullet there is, inform conversations related to continuing education and continuing competency standards. I will admit, this is an issue I get super excited about because the reality is people who get licensed, right, maybe spend 5, 7, 10, 12, 15 years of their life getting licensed. Then they spend the next 25 or 30 or 40 or 50 or 60 being licensed. So in the grand scheme of things, from a public protection perspective, it's actually continuing competency that is the more important issue than initial licensure. So NCARB wants to have more and more conversations about continuing competency, and what does that really mean? So when is that going to happen? Years from now. Here's what I'm going to tell you. We're going to talk timeline here a little bit later in this session tonight. AXP and ARE updates, that's happening in the next year to year and a half. These other things, we're talking years away. Because like I said, NCARB doesn't tend to do anything super fast. We all know that. So on that note, Jeremy, I think we're ready to jump into sort of our next question, discussion. Yeah. I don't know if anything's been rolling in the chat that we need to address right off the bat, or if anybody has any burning questions about the competency standard.
Nothing in chat so far. So who's up for questions on the competencies? Or on the process of how we got to where we are?
I was sort of wondering, I'm a student, and I've gone to places where like architects have spoken about having frustrations with people getting licensed earlier on in their career and not being as ready or as experienced as they might need to be for a lot of the stuff they engage in. Are there any plans to sort of address that, or any advice that you generally have for like how long you need to take, how experienced do you need to feel before you feel ready to be licensed?
Joseph, what just for kicks, what context are you in? What part of the country?
University of Kansas.
Okay, interesting. So there are provisions, like if there is if there are architects who are not who are not performing and meeting their obligations in terms of quality and legal compliance, there are ways that that can be addressed. It's actually, I've not heard personally, that's a little bit different sort of attitude than what I've heard from folks. So that's an interesting data point for me. But I think that the new approach to competency is to really assure that people have gotten, can demonstrate that skill across each of these. And, that I think, Jared, we feel pretty reasonable about the ability of future assessment methods to do that. But whether that's going to satisfy a seasoned architect who's just not happy about his competition, that's a different matter.
Yeah, and so Joseph, I will add, maybe anecdotally, I've spent 16 years plus at NCARB. I have had conversations with many an architect, as Jeremy referred to them, seasoned architects, who have what I would consider an unrealistic expectation for the just licensed individual. Because, and I will say, it's hard. It is really hard when you have been doing something for a decade or 2 decades to go back to that place where you were when you just started, right? And so what starts to happen is a lot of seasoned practitioners begin to assume that everybody should be as smart as they are. And as Jeremy had mentioned, right, they're well past competent. They have moved into proficient and the expert level. And so I would say a lot of times when people say that, it's like, sure, maybe there are people who have made it through the licensure process and really aren't competent today. That's actually what we're hoping to fix, right? We want everybody in the future to be competent. But one of the key skills of being competent in architecture is knowing what projects to not take on, especially by yourself, right? So the first day you get your license to practice architecture, probably not a great idea to go sign a contract on a new, high school that's being built in San Diego, California, right? Probably not a good idea, right? Unless you've spent your whole time working on schools in that area, right? So there's this element too about professional responsibility that is doing the work you're truly qualified to do and not overreaching. And if you're not qualified, partner with somebody who is, right? So that way, again, you can protect the public's interest as you're completing that project.
Beth.
Hi, thanks, Jared. Good to see you, Jeremy. So my question is about, you talked to some extent with regards to how much of the AREs would be adjusted for the competencies. I am curious about assessment methodologies and just sort of what you're envisioning in terms of out of these 16 competencies, where would they be validated through examination? Where would they be validated through experience? And then, you're talking to a room of educators.
Yeah.
What do you see being validated through education, if any? And just kind of curious about that and when we might know more in terms of where the validation will be happening. I mean, I think I do a lot of work with competencies and measuring competencies through experience at the BAC. That is what I do every day. And so I'm excited. I think I'm excited about the opportunity to get to know more about the cube beyond the cylinder, which is everything an architect can do, and sort of this, ways that competencies can expand beyond this, the many different ways that we are justifying it, but minimally qualified, or in this case, competent person. And so, yeah, I'm just curious about where you see these competencies being validated and when we'll know about that.
Sure. So you're jumping ahead, Beth, on our
I know.
That's totally okay.
Too much. Give the good stuff.
The good stuff. So here's what I'm going to tell you. We're actually right now, when we get together, we have a different task force, which we'll tell you more about. When we get together, there's a belief in our task force that education could cover every single competency that's on that list that we just showed you. Now it's probably, let's be honest, it's not probably what you think of your traditional education today, but I think an educator who took a focus and had more academic freedom and flexibility in how they develop curriculum, how they partner maybe with local firms in the area, things like that. We have educators on our task force saying, oh, we can totally cover that competency. I could get somebody from 0 to done in an academic setting.
We were
Right.
talking to Beth Lundell Garver, Dean of Practice at the BAC. So I agree entirely that that is possible. But
Yes.
I think that I mean I think that that isn't just what, you know, we do have more. There's more than the minimally competent that we're after. And I mean, I think I'm interested in,
Yeah.
as we see our schools today, and the many things and pressures that we're facing with accreditation and all the unknowns that, you know, that we have been, that we're experiencing with that, just when we might know more about, yeah, I'm totally skipping to the end, Jeremy.
Yeah, okay, so I'm gonna, because maybe I did this on purpose. I didn't put all of the assessment methods in the slide because I know if we start talking assessment methods with a bunch of educators, we're really gonna get into it, right? So at a high level, here's what NCARB is talking about with our task forces and other groups as we are kicking around ideas. So one, experience still matters, but we need to do a better way of actually validating that they know what they're supposed to know, that they're truly competent. Because Jeremy and I will be very honest, reporting hours doesn't mean you're competent, right? Reporting hours means you haven't been fired. It does not mean you're competent in the 6 experience areas today. So we are having much more robust conversations about how do we use real student work, whether it's done in an academic setting, whether it's done at a firm. How do you take an individual's work and validate their competency based on, dare I say it, a portfolio of some fashion, right? We know that that's kind of a critical way of showing that you can actually do this stuff, but not just pretty pictures portfolios, but right, getting into the technical, having a dialogue or some sort of written interaction that gets us to the point of you really know it. So that's one of our big things. We're digging deep right now into how we could scale a portfolio at that level. We are still looking at standardized assessments. Like, we got to admit, like, tests work for some people because they can be quick and efficient. You show up, do a test, check a box, you're done. So we're still looking at some standardized assessments. They're not going to go away. The other thing we're looking at is a more interesting form, which is really self-study. So what we also know is that not everybody does great at testing, especially in a timed environment. So is there a way to roll out basically content with integrated tests, but in an untimed way? So it's still structured, it's just less like formal, as a way for people to still demonstrate they're competent still in an important way, but not in such a stressful way. So we don't even know what to call this yet. We refer to it as like maybe some guided self-study with integrated assessments. Like, we don't know, but we're talking about something like that. Let's see, Jeremy, what else have we got on the table? We got standard assessments. Oh, and then we're also just talking about education, right? Like validated education, because we know it's like, if you've already done it and it's been validated at an educational level, why would we make you do it again? And this is one of the big things you're going to see in the slides. Our goal is to actually remove some of the redundancy that we believe is in the current licensure process. And so you'll hear more about that in a few minutes.
Yeah. Jared, we have, I want to take Lindy's question in chat, and then I see you, Kiwana, will come to you. Lindy's question is, it's a couple people plus one, is, you know, how do we address ethics and environmental sensitivities, indigenous and multicultural perspectives? How is this addressed? And I'll start by, you know, pointing to the, you know, nothing jumps off the page at you, and that's partly on purpose. Number 4, competency 4, supports public and environmental well-being. That starts to get in there, as well as, you know, we talked about the ethical obligations elsewhere. But I know this was a topic of much discussion in the competency task force. Do you want to give some background on that?
Sure, we do. And Jeremy, you mentioned it's sprinkled across the few. So we mentioned the sort of the integrating socio-demographic considerations, you know, into design. You mentioned the design principle already. And there is a specific competency on ethics and professional conduct. And that's something that's actually new. We sort of allude to it today we're calling that out as a more standard thing. I will again say, though, I think maybe the way the question was phrased is that might even be at a higher level than what we would expect for somebody who, again, is just licensed. But it doesn't mean you can't go there, right? From an educational setting, you can always move people past the competency standard. The competency standard is just what state licensing boards are going to be looking for.
All right, Kiwana?
Yes, I guess my question kind of touches on what what a lot of people have already been asking, but I'm wondering if the idea is that more architectural programs start to have the IPAL kind of program kind of going on. Because I'm hearing that you all are wanting to see more of these competencies and show up in schools of architecture. And honestly, having more IPAL programs, in my opinion, would be great, particularly for women in architecture. I'm thinking about the fact that a lot of women, when they are getting licensed, that's also when they're starting a family, when they're kind of doing a lot in life. A lot is happening in life. So I'm curious if you all see these new competencies and more integration into higher ed as a way to bring more of those programs to schools.
So I guess my reaction is going to be, I don't think it's going to create more IPAL programs. I just don't. Because IPAL, like the way IPAL is structured is very much about the big programs of today. To be honest, IPAL might go away in like when we're talking 5 years down the road, now not right away, but we're talking 5-7 years down the road, if the competency standard becomes the basis, and when we talk about the licensure process and you see how we're trying to re-envision it, IPAL might not be a fit anymore in its current structure. But you're right that I think some education programs might be like, oh, we're going to capitalize on this competency standard thing. And they're going to do it in a way that might mimic some of what's happening in IPAL today, but it won't be called like an IPAL program. It's just going to be whatever that school wants to do with their students. That's my guess. And like I said, it's a prediction and don't hold me to it. That's 5-7 years from now.
I mean, I'm optimistic about the fact that, maybe it doesn't survive in its current state, but that there starts to be some kind of process built into education that kind of lightens the burden that a lot of recent graduates have to deal with when they're studying and all of that. I mean, that's a very heavy point in someone's life. And so could we become I think about other kind of professional programs, outside of architecture, medical programs, and how it is steps. And so thinking about architecture possibly having steps, and that the competencies can assist with that. That makes me excited.
Yeah.
I want to hit a couple of questions that are in the chat. How would updates to AXP standards affect someone in the process of logging hours? Again, the changes that Jared presented are short-term sort of baby steps changes. So if anything, it should make AXP a little bit more accessible to you. Anything more to add there, Jared?
Yeah, at a base level, the upcoming updates to AXP and ARE, we're not changing the structure in any way. So it's still going to be the same 6 experience areas, the same 6 divisions of the ARE. Don't worry about credit models and transition charts and any of that business. It's low impact on purpose because what we want are people who are currently in the process. If it's working for you, get done.
Right. And any longer term changes will also take a while to percolate through different jurisdictions. So what we always tell people is if you're working and you don't yet have a license and you don't yet have an NCARB certificate, keep logging your hours. So just keep tracking them. See, there was Nia asked about the competency and the knowledge. Again, that our definition is in the slide we had earlier, Nia, is that the competency is different than just a skill or just knowledge. It is that combination of it's the ability to perform a job function, and it's an observable ability integrating knowledge, skills, attitudes, and behavior. So more than just a skill. and more than just knowing.
Be
I
ready to
think
jump to the next
that
section. Everyone wants to know
covers,
about mutual
covers
licensing.
everybody's questions, except for the ones we're about to answer in with more detail. Everybody's been waiting for.
Okay, let's go. They still want to jump to the end. I'm trying to hold back, right? Deliver the big punch. It's too late. Okay, so let's talk about
So,
the future of assessment and why, Jeremy. Why are we changing?
exactly. So one thing is we want to, there's some sentiment like, oh my God, what is NCARB doing? The sky is falling. And this for us is, yes, it's significant change, but it's also routine. We deployed our last major program updates in 2016, but we also deployed program changes in 2009, in 1996, and in 1978. So, this is sort of routine updates for us, looking at, again, what is the state of architectural practice? What is the state of the art in assessment? What is the state of, and this goes into the next point, what is the state of regulation and public sentiments about regulation, right? And so focusing again on the streamlining, so that we're only assessing and regulating what is necessary to protect the public and not overstepping that mandate. And then there's also been, considerable cost about overall cost and time to licensure, and particularly how that, as education costs have gone up, as we have learned more about how systems affect some populations differently, we want to, seek ways to improve that. And so that's those were really the big motivations that drove, what we are headed toward now.
So
And so
our goals, as NCARB said, okay, we're going to re-envision the licensure process. What are we going to try to accomplish? So came up with 3 goals. These 3 goals have been reinforced by our board of directors, and these are really the marching orders that have been given to the task force and all of the committees that are starting to work on this effort. So number 1, we want to increase the inclusivity of the licensure process. I mentioned earlier, not everybody's a good test taker, but we make everybody take tests, right? Sometimes people struggle to find employment, especially if you're an international student. Guess what? You don't get to work in this country unless you have the right credentials and the right visas, right? So we want to come up with ways that increase the inclusivity of the licensure process. Second thing we want to do is we want to increase the flexibility to demonstrate competency. There's not a lot of flexibility today. Like, let's be honest, right? The most flexibility somebody has in the licensure process today is deciding where they want to go to school, right? And then they have to get accepted. But if they can get accepted into your program, that's probably the most choice they have, right? Because after that, NCARB tells them, here's what you've got to do for the experience program, and here's what you've got to take for the exam. And they don't really get a choice, right? You've got to go through it. So we want to increase flexibility, and we're going to talk to you about how we're going to do that here in a couple of slides. And then, of course, there's a huge goal for us at NCARB, which is we need uniform acceptance by the member boards. We can't create a whole new system and then only have 15 states adopt it. That would be a nightmare, right? Because then it's like, well, I got a license in Kansas. Well, great, but Minnesota's not going to license you. Well, that's a problem, right? Or you get licensed in California. Well, okay, but Nevada doesn't going to be a license. So that's a problem. So there's one of the underlying goals at NCARB is, of course, uniform acceptance by member boards. So we've been on a roadshow, admittedly, already talking to our state licensing boards about, like, here's what we're thinking of doing. Tell us what you don't like. Here's what we're thinking of doing. Tell us what you love, right? Because we are going to have to navigate coming up with a solution that actually is adoptable, not perfect. I'm going to tell you right now, this is probably not going to be a perfect solution, because if we go for perfect, we're going to get, a third of our boards to adopt it, and the other 2/3 won't. And so there's a reality about uniform acceptance being a critical factor for us.
Jared,
Yes, Jeremy.
before we jump slides, if you go back, something we didn't think of earlier, but I think is important to this audience, is the increased flexibility to demonstrate competency. because that is one where, we run into, if there's an economic downturn, the industry loses people because they can't get jobs, so they can't complete their experience requirements. Or, we have plenty of folks who are in academia who, want to go straight into teaching and haven't necessarily worked, or they've gotten really, had really great opportunities to teach. And so, what we're trying to create is, again, this increased flexibility so that there's multiple ways to demonstrate your competency rather than one, mandated path.
Okay, so here's the concept that has been sort of formulated and is sort of taking shape. So number one, we want to develop a real modular approach to assessing the individual competencies. So not 6 big exams or 9 big exams like we had before, but actually breaking each competency down and coming up with different ways to assess that competency. So in the future, we're envisioning basically a transcript of 16 competencies, right? And if you can check the box on each of those 16 competencies, regardless of whether you did it in education, whether you do it through some sort of demonstrated experience, or whether you do it by doing some sort of assessment, if you check the box, you check the box, you're done, right? So really breaking it down, taking it one competency at a time. We don't do that today. You all know that. We love to lump things together, and we have these big programs called AXP and ARE, okay? So that's the first, and people are buying it. Like our state licensing boards are like, okay, they get that. They're like, sure, if there are 16 competencies and somebody can demonstrate each competency and it's been validated in some way, awesome, we'll give somebody a license. I'm like, great, that's what I love to hear. Second thing we want to do, we care about educational outcomes from various degrees. You've heard NCARB talk about this. It can be any type of degree. Education is education in our mind. Doesn't matter if it's a 2-year program, a 4-year program, a master's degree, a 4+2, 4+3, right? Education is education. As long as you're covering the competency, that's what we care about. We're not going to care about all the other stuff. We know there's a bunch of other stuff in education. It's outside our purview. Great. Run with it. Have as much fun as you want. It's not going to count towards licensure. That's okay, right? The third thing we really want to do is we want to break down these large program structures. Like the problem with something like an AXP or an ARE today is it really becomes this all or nothing. And even the exams today, even though the exams are broken down, you take 6 exams, even inside of the exams, then each division becomes all or nothing, right? People take a 5-hour exam, they do well on, 50% of it, or let's say four of the 6 domains inside of the exam, but they get a failing score, so they get to do it all over again. And so part of what we want to do is we want to break that down, right? And we hear that feedback all the time. People are like, you're telling me I did okay on content area number 1 the first time I took it, but I didn't do well on these other ones, so I have to retake the whole exam. And we're like, yes. And then they take the exam again and they do well on content area 1 and content area 2. And then they say, okay, I did good on 1 and 2 again. Now you're telling me I got to take it again. I'm like, yes. So it's like, it's not working for people, right? Because that creates overhead. Overhead is cost. Cost is time. So we want to break it down. Same thing with how we're going to sort of consume experience as well. So that's the big concept. And I will tell you, state licensing boards are agreeing with these concepts. 16 competencies, check the boxes. Yes, education plays a role. We got to make sure it's validated in some way. And then lastly, break it down. Make it smaller, make it more consumable for the individual. So what could this mean, Jeremy, if we accomplish those 3 big things? What do we expect to happen?
So we think that the accredited degree remains a way of demonstrating competency, but that other educational degrees and credentials will count if they are validated. And so that is opening up that opportunity. That work experience remains an authentic way to demonstrate competency, and future assessment methods allow experience to be more robust in pursuit of competency. And I think that's getting to some of the questions I was watching in the chat where people were saying, oh, what is this? Can education play a bigger role? Yes, it can. Can there be alternatives or fewer AXP hours potentially, fewer exams potentially? So yes, all of this again is to create those multiple pathways and multiple opportunities to demonstrate competencies. So if you're not good at taking tests, you might have another way to demonstrate the competency. Standardized assessments still exist. We've talked about, there's a lot of questions about the exam, and we've started internally trying not to say the exam, because, while Jared said, yes, there will be some test assessments that's going to be unavoidable, there is not going to be the exam as you know it today, that everyone must take the exam. There will be some assessments, and some you will need to take, but others you will have other options on. So
Wait a minute, Jeremy. I'm
assessments
gonna put on my hat from individuals who talked about SAM and say, wait a minute, I took 9 exams when I became a licensed architect. And now you're telling me that in the future, like, not everybody's gonna have to take those same 9 exams. So you must just be making the process easier. And what do you say, Jeremy? This is where you
Sorry, I was reading the chat. I didn't know I was going to get a question.
Right. Well, I guess I can give the
We're
answer.
not making it easier. We're
Not
making
making it easier. But I will tell you, here's what we're going to do. We're going to care about is the person competent? And I will tell you, every time and I've heard this comment way more than you can imagine, I always redirect them and say, wait, if that person is competent and they've demonstrated that they are fully competent in those 16 areas, are you saying there's any reason you shouldn't give them a license? Regardless of how many tests they took, regardless of what degree they hold, right? You're telling me if somebody's competent in those 16 areas, you can come up with a reason to not give them a license, right? And honestly, when you challenge somebody that way, the answer is like, well, no. And I'm like, exactly. So that's the answer. If somebody has demonstrated competency in those 16 areas, they should get a license. Doesn't matter why they want the license. Doesn't matter what they're going to do with the license. They've earned it. They're competent. They get a license. That's the reality.
All right.
Okay, we got some hands up. People are ready to go to questions, Jeremy. I think we can. We got a few slides to go, but I think we can jump to some of the questions. I think these are the hot
okay. And I do see several in chat. I want to come back, Karen. I do want to address the questions you're asking, but I want to hold those for just a minute. Rob Fleming first, and then Robert Gonzalez.
Hey, Jeremy and Jared, this is a great conversation. It's bringing up a really probably far-reaching thought about the end game of this. Let's say that a school is teaching a studio on validating design. Let's just say they can assess design. One of the things that we're seeing in schools a lot are group projects. And so you've got 4 students in a group, and sometimes, I hate to say it, 1 or 2 students will dominate the group and achieve the competency, while the other 2 just kind of go along to get along. So I do think there are some relatively far-reaching conclusions that we're going to start coming to. And since, Jeremy, there's a bunch of people meeting in a few days, I was curious what people here thought about that. Do they already face that in terms of NAB? And I'm just curious how people are dealing with that.
And I would say, I think, Rob, you bring up a huge point. Even Jeremy and I, we were at the Scholars in Professional Practice that NCARB hosts this summer. Had a great conversation with the scholars there too, because we kind of showed them some of these ideas, and they actually brought up a similar point. They're like, yeah, but like this is, and we know this, like this is hard for you all, right? When you're in a class setting and you want to do group projects, because you know teamwork and collaboration is a huge critical skill that you need people to build. Right? But then how do you parse out and properly assess the individual in the group dynamic, right? And I'm going to say that I think is a challenge that we'll fall back on. If education says they want to own competencies and they want to basically say, hey, I think this person's competent, then if you're going to do group projects to get there, you're going to have to figure out your process to parse that out. If you're not willing to, admittedly, then I'm going to say, well, it's maybe not the right competency to pursue.
Fair enough.
Robert Gonzalez.
Hi, I'm sorry. I jumped in a little late. So this is great. I mean, it's sounding to me also very exciting. But of course, I'm a dean of an architecture school, so I'm looking at all of this from an educational perspective. Students decide that they want to explore architecture through universities. So we're their first contact, typically through our high school programs, and then the thousands and thousands of students who decide they want to major in architecture. So I'm excited, that we might be able to in the future explore different ways to get there. I was there at the conference in Denver, and I will say, you know, the reading the room, there was a lot of despair and concern, and there was a feeling that this all happened without us at the table, and I'm not sure that's true. I don't know. You know, you said you surveyed lots of people, and I know you have lots of committees. So I trust that there were a lot of educators involved along the way, but there was still a feeling. So I, you know, I love the idea that educators can continue to be part of this process. I also, one part I really like hearing is the modules. Like, I would love to see a university program um, get all those competencies out. And so I'm wondering, you know, are you thinking about that too? Are you thinking, wow, there might be the possibility that we might have some architecture programs that will deliver all of this, and or deliver a lot of it, so that maybe students don't have to take all the exams when they get out? Maybe there's a process for our curricula to cover that, and maybe they're taking the exams through the university. I mean, would you be willing to work, I guess, as an organization directly with the schools to explore these possibilities as options, and also to explore possibilities for internships so that it goes through the university program? So I guess the subtext of all of this is, are you willing to give some of it up, give some of the control of the internship program process or the exam process, and work with university programs to establish some kind of new pathway? You know, I worked as an intern for years in Barcelona and Spain, and we know that there are a lot of countries where you get licensed upon graduation. So I'm hoping that the flexibility, the modules, all of that will allow for some of these things to also happen.
See, Robert
Thank
gets a
you.
lot of questions in there. So I think at a high level, my quick answer is yes to most of what you said, which is at a high level, is NCARB willing to give some of this stuff up? Yeah, that's the whole point of us doing this, right? Like, NCARB needs to care about the stuff NCARB cares about, which is we care about making sure people are competent back so that we can validate that individual to a state licensing board. That's our core function, right? Our members are the 55 licensing boards. So that's the key. Can we collaborate with education to do this? Absolutely. What you all don't know is Jeremy took your names down, and we're going to be contacting you over the course of the next year to year and a half, because we're not done with this development process. I'm going to show you a timeline here in a couple of slides. We're in it right now. Like, we at least have gotten to the place of going, yeah, we see a different future. But now we all need to figure out exactly how that's going to work, because it's not going to do any good for Jeremy and I to sit in a closet, come up with some grand idea of what education is going to be, and then spring it on you 2 years from now, and then you all look at us and say we're stupid. Like, that's not an effective development process. We're not going to do that. So Robert, I think at a high level, yes, I think you can tell I'm excited about this too, because I'm excited about where we, the profession, where licensure could be, you know, 5-7 years from now. But I know it's going to take that long to get there. This is not a quick turn the ship. This is a nice gradual curve that we're all going to have to make together.
Yeah, and I will add that, specific to the point about internships, you know, schools, there are plenty of schools right now who facilitate internships, you know, BAC being one of them, and Beth. You know, so that's something that exists now. But in terms of, you know, how do we know, you know, not thinking about AXP as we know it today, but how is a competency met through experience, there will be some documentation requirement of how we, you know, validate that. And so, you know, that will be the future. I want to, lots of good questions.
Okay, I think, well, you're skimming questions in the chat, Jeremy. Why don't we go to Garrick? He's had his hand up for a bit.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
I feel a little bit kind of like a foreigner, not that I am not, but I'm a structural engineer. A lot of things that you're discussing are very interesting for me. So not only I'm practicing engineer, but also I taught structures here in Boston area at Northeastern, Boston Architectural Center, and now for 35 years at Wentworth Institute of Technology, that we became accredited about 35 years ago. And a lot of these ideas that you were discussing, I parallel them to how structural engineers taking their exams, and they're proving their competency by passing the exam. That somebody who is more experienced than they are reviews their calculations, reviews their design, their project type design, and they decide that this is reasonably well done. I cannot see how by the way, I want to add also that I started obviously quite a few years back, that we used to have, for example, in Boston, in Massachusetts, that if you had 20 years of experience, you didn't have to take an exam. You had a discussion with the experienced engineer sitting with the board who decided to register you. And the board would invite other people that they knew, and I was one of them, in several occasions. And by discussing it with this person, evaluating their experience, they got licensed. But there was 20 years of experience. They didn't have to go to college. By the way, lawyers also do that. So but lawyers are not responsible for safety of regular population. And so I trying to understand how you're planning of evaluating competency in systems of the building, not just structural. I'm being selfish, but we'll hopefully agree that all of the other systems are hanging from the structural system. And so how do we know if these discussions, or that it's brought to educational area when people who are not licensed are teaching and never design anything? How do they induce this knowledge of all of the systems that architect has to know and has to be capable of evaluating at least enough that when they're doing their regular construction visits, they would notice something. I'm not saying that they will check, but they would notice something that is not right and go to their consultants to verify it. How those type of competencies will be assessed by discussions or by group studying or group projects.
Sure. I will try to give you a quick answer, which is sort of one of NCARB's next steps as we go into the next year is really digging into what we're calling the assessment criteria for each of these competencies that you see there. And there is the competency around integrating building systems right into the overall design. So if we were to play this out in the future, what would end up happening was if there's an educational setting that says we're gonna make sure we get our candidates fully competent in this area, at the end, whether it's a capstone project or something like that, there's going to have to be this demonstration of that full integration of those systems. And like you said, back in the old sort of oral interview days of the structural engineer, that means you're going to have the right people in the room to ask the questions and validate against that scoring rubric, right? Because that's whoever scores a rubric has to know what's actually being asked about that rubric. So could it happen? Yes. Again, is it going to probably be a single faculty member grading every single project? Probably not, right? If you're trying to take on that competency, which is a really big one, it's in education, it's probably going to be done in a more team way of doing it. Because think how honestly cool that could be if a student's presenting their work and in the room is the architectural faculty, a structural engineer, a mechanical engineer, right? Giving that student real feedback and assessing their work. I mean, come on, that's way better than any education I ever had when I went to school. So, but again, that's a choice that a school has to make to want to go down that path.
Jared, I want to go to John and then Marcia. Then I have one question from the chat I want to address. And then I want to move to our
move us along. Okay.
Slides, and then I'll circle back more later.
Okay. I think John was called on and he wanted to
Okay,
come in.
great. I'm here. Thanks. And Jared and Jeremy, you can just mute me if I'm saying anything I'm not supposed to say right now, but but I've been one of the educators involved in this, and I've been very honored to be on the licensure R&D task force for a number of years, and I came into it very not skeptical, but concerned that paths of licensure would be built that didn't involve education. There was, this talk about education being this big barrier, being really expensive, taking all this time, and some rhetoric about how coming out of education, you learn everything you need to learn in practice anyway, so it should just be experience. But it's been really amazing to see things evolve to get to this point to where we all have it, and to really recognize that. And I want to build on Robert's comment too, that education is the way that people come into the profession. And so we've been able to start to talk about the differences between barriers. Every step we make is a barrier, but differences between barriers and filters, and how do we actually break the filters as much as the barriers, and sort of, to truly create an inclusive pathway. And I feel like we're really getting there. And it's getting, to me as an educator, I'm very, very excited about where this is heading. I think we have a potential pathway that recognizes education as an experience thing, even if it's not internships for credit. We do all sorts of things in education that should count as experience. We do projects that engage communities. We do solar decathlon projects. We do design build studios. All of these things are real world experience that should count. And right now it doesn't. And this is a way to get there. I'm really excited about pathways to licensure for educators. That has been a gap in our discipline for a long time, that there are so many, we've lamented that there are so many people who teach architecture who aren't licensed architects. So this is a great acknowledgement of that part of the problem is that we don't have a pathway for educators. So it's all very exciting to me. So that's all. I don't even have a question. I'm excited, and I'm ready to take it to the next step.
Great. Thanks, John. Yes, I've had the privilege of working with John for the last couple of years on the task force. And I actually see in the chat that so one of my faculty, I better be careful what I say about going to school at North Dakota State University back in the late 90s or late 80s, early 90s, because one of my faculty members is on this call right now. So I will call out Dan Farrow. It was great to see you again, Dan. I hope things are going well. And yeah, things are going pretty well for me at NCARB too, I will say. It's been a good run. Let's go to Marcia.
Hello. It's interesting that John just mentioned pathway to educators. Have had a unique experience of being both an educator and a trainer in a firm to train people coming in. And I lamented when NCARB did away with giving us credit for teaching in the last round. I actually did rack up quite a few hours there, and then all of a sudden that was taken away. And because I hadn't gotten my license at the time, I had to restart my clock. So that was an easy solution to give some credit to those who were actual faculties. And I think we got up to less than 1,000 hours. Nothing crazy, but it did count. And that would be great to revisit that option to kind of allow for more of our educators to be licensed. My question actually has to do more with the experience, what happens after education. And I welcome the competency to be more streamlined and structured so that all firms would maybe have a clean template or a consistent template to use. And I think if these modules that you're talking about and these competencies is more streamlined, and maybe with some examples as to how that can happen, because when I started working for a firm, and I said, hey, I needed these extra hours, it wasn't that they knew what to do. They asked me, well, how do you want these hours? And I'm thinking, well, why are you asking me that question? And I think if we have that, NCARB really could help to facilitate the more consistent experience across the board. And, just say this to all of the firms or anyone who is looking to coordinate their experience. Here's the document. Here, you do have the list of competencies, but I think if it's more of a learning and structured, then it's easier for your supervisors to actually allow for that to happen. Because, sometimes things don't always get covered, but they get signed off on.
Right. Yeah, those are all very good points, Marcia, right? It can be a real challenge sometimes to just navigate the current experience program. And if firms aren't active, and understanding it, yeah, licensure candidates can feel like they're on their own, which then that's also why people maybe leave the path, right? And that's what we don't want. If they're competent, we want them to stay on the path and we want them to get licensed.
All right. We're running down to our last 10 minutes. I want to do some rapid fire.
Jump ahead.
Well, I have one thing I want to address first. There was one that said uniform acceptance by member boards, and someone wanted to clarify that. What about acceptance by NAB, AIA, and ACSA? NCARB works for member boards, and so that's they're the ones who determine who gets a license and what's required for a license. So they're the ones that have to have the uniform acceptance from our standpoint. Then I did want to acknowledge there was some good discussion in the chat. Karen had to leave, I think, but there was some good discussion about language, offering of the exam or the future exams in multiple languages, and also about esoteric language in the current exam. I know, Jared, and I'll just hit this briefly, and maybe we can come back to it later if people have more questions. But I know that, over the last several years, you and your team have done a really great job of pretty incredible job of scrubbing the language and checking for things that are difficult or causing people to stumble. But do you want to say just a word about multiple languages and people from different countries?
Yeah, so NCARB, we looked into it because we did a study, right? All the different candidates that are taking the exam. We looked at translating the exam into multiple languages. Bottom line is it's a cost issue. It costs a lot of money to do a full translation of the exam into a different language. And then we got into the debate of and how many languages. I actually saw some of that scroll through in the chat, Jeremy. And I think she mentioned she has students from 20 different countries. So that, very realistically could be speaking anywhere from 10 to 12 different languages or dialects. NCARB can't afford to do that. So obviously what you probably hopefully all heard of is that a couple of years ago, NCARB launched an ESL testing accommodation, which gives candidates the ability to either to get extra time and or bring their own word for word translation dictionary to the exam with them. So that was the path we chose to help address candidates that are not native English readers or speakers, because what we did is financially, we were like, yeah, we can't, we could translate it into one language, but as soon as you do that, what you've just done is said, well, then what about the next language and the next one and the next one? So check out the ESL accommodation. Please let your students know that it exists. Any accommodation that they're getting in school, they should be talking to NCARB about that accommodation on the exam as well. We offer testing accommodations all over the place. We just don't tell you who uses them, just like you don't tell people at school. Okay, so let's talk timeline so you get a sense of where we're headed and how this is going to go. We are in 2025, and in 2025, NCARB is still in research mode. John mentioned he's on the task force. We are still meeting as a task force. We have a meeting coming up here in March. We're researching, we're data gathering, and we're refining this design concept. What we presented earlier was super, super high level concept. Our plan is to refine that concept down between now and the end of June to be at what I would call schematic design. John and I are in no way ready to deliver construction documents. We are only at schematic design. People, you gotta give us time, okay? I keep trying to slow people down, John. You can tell, I'm calm down. We got a lot of work ahead of us. Okay, in 2026, what's going to happen inside of the calendar year is that NCARB is going to start to really finalize the program design and the requirements. So between now and a year and a half from now, as we are working on the quick updates to AXP and ARE, we're also going to be trying to refine this bigger design of the future licensure process. That's when we do need to engage with you more. So I will thank Mike Monty again for inviting Jeremy and I to do this presentation and engage with you, because we need to keep doing this as we get more and more detail, and then you can hammer it, and then we can make it better, and then we can get more detail, and then you can hammer it, and we can make it better. That's how we develop a good program. So that's 2026. 2027, 2028. By this time, Jeremy's probably thinking about retirement, just like Harry. I'm not going to let him retire. Because in 27 and 28, we need to build the assessments, all these assessments we're talking about. If you want to start rolling out competencies in your programs, you're going to need 2027 and 2028 to start refining your curriculum, thinking about how you're going to do it. Add team projects, get rid of team projects, do all that great stuff that I know is flowing through your minds right now, right? That's 2027, 2028. I'm going to be busy creating all kinds of stuff inside of NCARB at that time. I know that. 2029. Okay, now we're getting close. This is when I actually think something's going to get turned on. So we're talking 4 years from now. Hopefully by 2029, we start turning on the early kind of what we're calling our minimum viable product for what this licensure process is going to be. If we get super lucky, it's coming out in 2028. Jeremy's got to work really, really hard to make that happen. Right, Jeremy? Got it. I just need you to shake your head. Yes, this is being recorded. Okay, so but more realistically, 2029 is when we are likely going to be turning on new licensure programs. It doesn't mean the current ones are going away. ARE 5.0 is still going to be there. AXP is still going to be there. People going through the licensure process need time to transition as well. So 2029, we start supporting the transition over to the new licensure process. And admittedly, 2030 is the goal, right? By 2030, what we really hope is that we have supported that final transition to this new competency-based licensure program. The big ARE is dead. The big AXP is dead, and we're really focused on the 16 competencies. And the one question you haven't asked, and you should have, is, but are the competencies going to get updated? And of course, the answer is yes, right? Nothing is static. Jeremy said that earlier. So, but one of the benefits is if we need to update a single competency, that is a way better thing to do than try to update giant programs like the ARE today. So I don't think we're going to be updating the competency standard anytime in the very near future. But I fully anticipate that by 2030, some of you are going to say, hey, you know, Jared, we probably need to make a little tweak to this competency. And we're going to probably start looking at it, in all honesty, because it'll be time. Like, that's the cycle of what we do at NCARB, this constant evolution of our programs. So on that note, Jeremy, I think we have made it to the end. I know you had a couple things in closing that you did want to share.
Yeah. So and the one thing I'll tack on to what you just said about the future and the evolution is that one of the things that also could evolve is the means of demonstrating the competencies. We may continue to roll out additional or replacement means of demonstrating the competencies over time. What is the competency standard in the future license process? It is the ongoing evolution to NCARB's programs, the legally defined expectations of architects in the United States. It is more concise than the previous expectations of competency. You know, we're going down from those 96 tasks and 79 objectives and the NAB requirements and to this more concise list of what is required for licensure. And so it is also something that can be guidance to educators and schools and programs that wish to focus on preparing students for entry to licensure. So as Robert said earlier, it is definitely, a great opportunity to say, we can do this. We can get you there. For schools that want to do that and focus on acquiring these in education, yes, great. What is it not? It is not, drum roll.
It is not advancing, is what it's not. There we go.
It's not a list of requirements for schools, and it's not an accreditation standard. And so I think those are the really big takeaways. A lot of folks have, some initial reaction was, oh my God, what are you doing requiring this of us? We're not. We're saying this is what's required for people who want to get licensed, and whichever ones of those to whatever depth you want to cover in education, that's great.
Okay.
And lastly, some of you have already jumped on the bandwagon about being excited, and I'm so glad. We're so excited to hear that, because we do think that it's an interesting opportunity. We have the big world of architecture. This is another version of the cylinder and the cube, right, Beth? This is an attempt to look at it in a different way. We got some people who didn't like the cylinder and the cube. Here's another version, right? The world of architecture. And then there is, this bubble that we call competency for initial licensure. It's in there. And that's the must-do component. And then there's more. You can expand. You can get that professional degree. You can get the advanced professional degree. You can do your specialization and get to that expert level through your career. So we don't have a lot of time to share or discuss this, but the big question we had for you is, can your college or university get students to a point where they've achieved one or more of the competencies? I know Robert alluded to sort of some of the tension in the air when we presented at administrators conference, but I also had people come up to me in the hallway afterward and say, oh my God, we can do that at our school. So for every school that said, we can't do that, no way we could do that, there's another school that says we can. And so I think there are opportunities here that can, that really can be positive. And if you're freed.
I was going to say, Jeremy, I think too, the other thing we've heard is there may have been some earliest idea that like you're going to do everything, which sure, maybe you could, but I don't think that's a realistic first step. I think people are going to self-select on the ones they want to focus on. And it's not going to be surprising to NCARB that different schools are going to have different focus areas. Different schools might achieve different competencies. That's okay. See, we're not trying to approach this as a one size fits every place. It really is about, if you think it fits for you, go for it. If you don't want to do any of these, you're not going to hurt our feelings. Like Jeremy and I are going to be upset if you tell us someday, like, whatever, we don't care about the 16 competencies. We're going to be like, okay, thanks for letting us know. Like, that's the reality of this.
Yeah, but this is the future of what's going to be required for licensure, for folks to demonstrate their competencies for licensure. The other thing that we certainly heard, you all have seen it in a myriad of places, but it was also featured in the Journal of Higher Ed when the editor presented to the administrators about the various challenges and opportunities facing education writ large. And there was a big focus on this opportunity for specializations, for continuing competency, for people coming back to school from having partially completed a degree. And we think that this model for education does further expand those opportunities. Again, I think someone earlier commented on that potential for continuing education and continuing professional development. We think and hope there's some real exciting opportunities there as well.
So we're going to go ahead and stop sharing. We have come to the end of our time. We will happily stay on. Or I guess I can stay on and answer a few more questions if that works for people. Kathy, if you need to get out of here, just end the webinar and it's over. Like, it's really up to you.
Well, no, before we do that, we do want to thank you. Thank you, Jared. Thank you for Jeremy for taking the time to go through all of this with us. I think it's helpful for those members who are at the November meeting to see how the information and presentation that you shared with us has even evolved from November, and I think in a positive way for educators. I hope what you heard from some of the comments is a real interest in deeper and more participation in the work as it continues. So I hope we can talk more concretely about how that can happen. I also do want to point out to our members that we do have caucus meetings coming up that will allow more conversation around both this, but also the relationship between accreditation, licensure, and education. There is a meeting on February 19th called Competencies and Continuum. That will be 7 to 8:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Mike, I don't know if you're going to drop in. Oh, yeah, some notes about other upcoming caucuses. We have the future of membership and faculty development as well. In this meeting and in other meetings, we've talked about this growing ecosystem of architecture education, including community colleges, four-year programs, accredited programs, and that means we have to really rethink our membership structure. So we want to invite all of you to that as well. And then we have a number of other webinars that we're putting forth to support our members. I know we're a little bit over time, so I'll end it with that. Thank you, everybody, for taking the time to join us today. We hope we have continued robust discussions about all of this. And then Jared and Jeremy, if you want to stay on to take a few extra questions, Mike, I think we could stay on for a few more minutes. But otherwise, thanks so much.
I did see there was the question about like who's on this task force right now. It's called our licensure process R&D. So we don't put on our website the list of everybody who's on our task force, but I will share publicly because I know they're okay with me sharing this. Well, John Dwyer already outed himself on this webinar. So he has been a member of the task force since its inception a couple of years ago. Our other educator who's on the task force is Greg Wynn. Many of you probably know him. He's from Cal Poly San Luis Obispo. He teaches architecture out there. He's one of our other ones. And then also Kevin Singh, he's no longer on our task force. He was, but how dare he run for the NCARB board of directors and wins the election. So Kevin was not able to be on our task force this year because he's on the board of directors. But also I'm sure he would be happy to take any feedback you have. So those three specific educators are very, very in tune with everything we're talking about. The other task force members are practicing architects, licensure candidates, this variety of people. I won't name every one of them because if you contacted them, they might freak out with like, why is this educator contacting me? Kind of thing. Or were there other questions, Jeremy, that you saw scrolling through the chat that you think we should definitely hit on before we take off? Or if somebody has another one, feel free to raise your hand.
Yeah, I will say, I will add, I think we have covered most of these questions. I know we did actually have Jared Harry misspoke a little bit when we were administrators, because there actually was one or two former educators on the competency task force as I went back and looked. So we did have folks there, but you also talked about all the interaction you had with 2 years worth of our education committee and everybody there.
All right. Well, again, I would thank you all again. Mike, Kathy, thanks for inviting us. I think we'll be happy to do this again as we continue to refine. Admittedly, I think the next time we're going to sort of make an advancement on this. So John, this falls on you and the task force, is realistically probably late summer, early fall, I think is when we're going to be at our next phase of refining this design, because we're kind of back in our research and iteration process right now. And that might be another good time to just check in and maybe specifically talk about some of these different assessment approaches we're thinking about. So then we could really dig into like, how would you validate this as an educational outcome? Or how would we, cover that in a portfolio or a project or something like that?
That sounds great. Count us in.
Okay.
All right. Thank you. Thanks, everyone.